Hello, welcome to our week 24 video in our Through My Bible in 1 Year series here at St. John's. You had read a good chunk of the book of Proverbs this past week, and I had asked you to just pick out some of the favorite Proverbs that you came across in this particular section. I like asking questions like that because there's no right or wrong answer. If one particularly stuck in your mind, that's great. I'll just go over a few that rang out in my ears as I read them. Proverbs 3 verses 5 and 6 perhaps is the most famous of all the Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Another proverb from this particular section that's always stuck in my mind is Proverbs 6 verse 6, not necessarily a very well-known proverb. It reads, "Go to the ant, you slacker, observe its ways and become wise." How interesting that even in the little details of God's creation, he can provide lessons for us. In the industriousness and the dedication of an ant, we almost feel convicted ourselves that we do not work as hard or in such an organized way as these little creatures of God do. There's so much that God can teach us through the big parts of his creation and the little parts of his creation as well. Also, a more famous proverb is Proverbs 9 verse 10. "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." Wisdom is a theme that's wrapped all around the Proverbs and comes up again and again. And to define wisdom, we go to where it starts, to put oneself underneath God, to arrange ourselves underneath his providential reign. And in doing so, we understand who we are, who he is in relation to us. And that then, the proverb writer says, is the beginning of true wisdom. You're going to continue through Proverbs this week and read chapters 16 through 28. We'll talk more about that in a minute. You had also read Romans 9 through 14, and I had asked you to consider this statement. Some Christians are under the mistaken impression that there is a separate salvation for Jewish people. And how do chapters 9 through 11 of Romans make it clear that there is only one way to be saved? If you look at Romans as a whole, or for that matter, Scripture as a whole, it's clear there is only one way to be saved. But there are a couple of words in this section that people do sometimes take out of context. Remember, at the beginning of this section, though, Paul talks about his relationship with the Jewish people, his brothers, as he calls them, and he says he has great sorrow when he thinks of the fate of those Jews who have not believed in Jesus. How would he have great sorrow if he knew that they were going to be saved eventually without believing in Jesus? No, his great sorrow, and this sorrow reaches in him to the point where he says, I wish I could be under the curse and that they could all be saved. Now, later he does say that all Israel will be saved. But that statement, all Israel will be saved, has to be understood in the context of Romans chapter 4 and Galatians chapter 3, where Paul uses that term Israel not then to define the people who are related to Abraham by birth, but rather the people who have the same faith as Abraham, spiritual Israel. That's the Israel that will be saved. And it is Paul's wish that physical Israel become part of spiritual Israel through faith in Jesus. As I mentioned, you will be continuing through Proverbs this week, but as you read Proverbs 16 through 28, list, if you would, some specific categories of sins that these chapters warn against, and we'll talk about that next time. And also, as you finish up the last 2 chapters of Romans, you will also be going into the first 3 chapters of Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. And right away in the first chapter, not to spoil it too much for you, but Paul refers to that Thessalonian congregation as a model congregation. Keep that word model in mind as you read all of 1 Thessalonians, and this week the first 3 chapters, and ask yourself, how were the Thessalonians models for first century believers and also for us? God's blessings on your readings this week, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.